Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants Section 1. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Book of Commandments. We're going to be talking about the Doctrine and Covenants and a couple of other things having to do with revelations pertaining to Section 1, which was a preface to a bunch, and how that relates into some of the things we get from the Joseph Smith papers. So again, if you're not familiar with this little video series that I'm doing, what we're going to be doing is talking about church history and the Doctrine and Covenants through the lens of what we've gained from the Joseph Smith Papers project, which has been going on for a very long time and has very recently concluded. Once again, you don't need to buy the books. In fact, the books don't have nearly as much as the website does, which is the josephsmithpapers.org. That is a full, fully throated. I mean, everything's included on that. You have the original papers. If you want to look at the paper with the handwriting for yourself, it's all on there. So this should be accessible to you. I'll be putting some links down in the descriptions. But let's get into it. Today is Section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Now, I don't want to toss the baby out with the bathwater here. For a long time, our Doctrine and Covenants, the section headings, were based on a series of books called The History of the Church. I have a very cheap little paperback copy here that I love. And this is what we used to use to say, hey, this revelation was received on this date. Here's who was in the room. Here was the circumstances behind it. And so because of that, I wanted to actually share a footnote from the history of the church, which gives a little bit of an insight into what brought this preface about. And so that it's old language, so forgive me for a moment here, but this is what it says in this footnote from the history of the church. The number of copies in the edition of the Book of Commandments to be printed, and it was considered, and the decision reached that 10,000 should be printed. The conference lasted 2 days. So the conference they're referring to is not a general conference. This was on the 1st of November, not in October when we usually have general conferences. But the original idea was 10,000 copies of the Book of Commandments. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Book of Commandments is, I brought a replica copy here. Big, huge thanks to the Community of Christ for publishing these for a very long time. I think this was under the title of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But this is a replica copy, very, very small. To maybe put it into context that might make sense to us book nerds out there, this is a proselyting copy of the Book of Mormon, and this is very much smaller than that. Again, this is just a replica copy that I got and you can kind of get a sense of how small these pages are. This was the original Book of Commandments. This was just a bunch of what we now call sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that were used to regulate the church. So it was not called the Doctrine of Covenants originally. This little guy was published in 1833 in Independence, Missouri, which at the time was the headquarters of the church. They had a printing office there, and they were planning on putting a temple there, which the church at the time didn't get to do. They were sort of kicked out of that area for some years. And I believe the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was able to build a temple there. They are now called the Community of Christ, so those two groups are interchangeable. But just wanted to show what that is. That was published in 1833. And these are dates that you'll need to remember, like the Book of Mormon, the original, and I've got a replica of that as well. The books to remember, Book of Mormon, pretty big deal. This one was published in 1830. That was in upstate New York. The next thing you get is 1833, 3 years later, Independence, Missouri, this little guy. And then we get a book called the Doctrine and Covenants. Again, you can kind of get a sense of size here. This was published in Kirtland, Ohio in 1835. So those are 3 dates you really want to remember: 30, 33, and 35. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So the original aspiration was for 10,000 copies of the Book of Commandments, and I will tell the story about how that never happened here pretty soon. And before that, I wanted to get into what this actual book is all about. So, and actually the preface itself, we'll go into the preface first. So the history of the church also has another footnote that reads that Joseph Smith asked the conference what testimony they were willing to attach to these commandments, which would shortly be sent to the world. A number of the brethren arose and said they were willing to testify to the world that they knew they were of the Lord. So what are we talking about? Well, In the original, again, Book of Mormon, if you go to the back page, some of you may or may not know about this, but this is a very, very important thing for kind of a proof of Book of Mormon literature. This is a testimony, this is the testimony of three witnesses. These were men, this is Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. These were three men who actually hefted the gold plates that these came from. They saw them, felt them with their hands. That's that. What you may not know is that there's another one right after that. This is in the original copy, and this is in our modern books too. This is the testimony of the 8 witnesses. So there were 8 plus 3 plus Joseph Smith. All of these men were able to actually see and taste and feel. They probably didn't taste it, but, heft and feel the actual golden plate. So they wrote that down because, let's face it, another book of scripture from God is a hard thing for people to swallow. So they put witnesses to it. They secured a copyright for the book, all of that stuff. What people may not know is that that same thing happened for the Book of Commandments. Now, because of the circumstances around the printing of this, that testimony page never actually showed up in the Book of Commandments. But 2 years later, 1835, you get it in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is, again, at the very, very back. There was a sort of, and to me, it reads more like minutes of a meeting. Just kind of getting here. There we go. It says here General Assembly, and there's a lot of things that kind of talk about the circumstances surrounding it. People are certifying copies of it. And then you get this testimony of the 12 apostles at the time, talking about how they testified that this book was true. And that is included in modern copies of the Doctrine and Covenants. So what you may not know is that there is also a witness page to the Doctrine and Covenants. So there you go. So because it was so important, because we have, a witness page, just like in the Book of Mormon, we're kind of setting this Book of Commandments up to be the same as the Book of Mormon, which I would say is pretty true. In the church, if you don't know, we have 4 standard works. We have the Bible, the Old and New Testament. We use the King James Version. We have the Book of Mormon. We have the Doctrine and Covenants, and then another collection of revelations and the history of our church in what we call the Pearl of Great Price. Those are the 4 books. And they're all our standard works. We quote them as scripture. So, yeah, big deal on this. So they thought we should come up with a preface to this. Joseph Smith Papers, and when I refer to this one, when I refer to documents, what I'm referring to is there is a series of books, blue label, entitled Documents. What's nice about this is that it kind of gives a chronological view of when these documents came about. So in this case, we're talking about section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So to this point, we already had a collection of revelations we wanted to, publish and put out. So section 1, as we see it in today's scriptures, is out of order. It was not the very first thing that they got. It was much later, in around 1833, when they were going to publish this book. I love this story, and this is a historical introduction from the Joseph Smith Paper Documents book. I just find this funny because I've lived this life myself. So this is from William E. McClellan. One of the conference participants gave a more detailed account of the production of the preface 50 years later to William Kelly, an elder in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. According to Kelly's account of the conversation, McClellan said that he, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery had been given the assignment to write the preface to the Book of Commandments. But when they presented their draft to the conference, quote, picked it all to pieces and requested that Joseph Smith petition the Lord for a preface. After Joseph Smith and the elders bowed in prayer, Joseph Smith, who was sitting by a window, dictated the preface by the Spirit, while Rigdon served as scribe. Joseph would deliver a few sentences, and Sidney would write them down, McClellan told Kelly, and then read them aloud. And if correct, then Joseph Smith would proceed and deliver more. In this way, the preface was given. So what I love about this is that anyone who's been in a group and has had to come up with a document that everybody agrees on knows that it's going to be picked all to pieces. And so, bless their hearts, they came, I'm sure they crafted a bunch of language. Everybody just hated it. They had all these comments to make. I love it that in my language, they just kind of went to Joseph Smith and said, like, dude, just get us a revelation and we'll just use that instead. The other thing I find really interesting about the preface and how it was given is very telling about Revelation and what might seem a little different. The Hollywood versions of this stuff, because you don't want to be going through the tedium of, editing text. Joseph's sitting by a window, and you might think that he just was, train of thought, just kind of went with it. The guy wrote it down, did the best he could. Maybe he didn't like this or that or spelled something wrong and whatever. No. In this case, what you have is Joseph, yes, was sitting by a window, but he's dictating a few phrases. And from what I can see here, either says, no, that's not right, this word instead of that word, or whatever the case may be, or he says, yes, that's accurate, and then move on. And it was given a little bit at a time until they were done. So that is a lot of call response, a lot of accuracy, a lot of fact checking to make sure that that was actually received correctly. So a little bit of an insight not only into how Joseph Smith would give out these things called revelations, but also how, what the scribes had to do. Again, a bunch of guys, and these are men that were in their mid-20s, maybe 30s back in 1833. They're not going to agree. They're going to come up with their own ideas, and that's going to cause some issues. So it's kind of nice to have a guy in the room that can just kind of dictate it out to you. So yes, Doctrine and Covenants section 1 is listed in Revelation book 1, which is where all of these Doctrine and Covenants sections were printed from. That's what they had. And so this is called a revelation in the book. So as you can see, revelation in big old letters up there. The first publication that we get is in the Book of Commandments, which for section 1 holds 7 verses. That's all you get, 7 verses. When the 1835 edition comes out, for starters, let's talk about this for a second. The Doctrine and Covenants, as it was way back in 1835, had more than we have now. Part 1, or the doctrine of it, is what we now call the Lectures on Faith. There were 7 of these. They were to teach doctrine, and in some cases, they were to be treated like a catechism. They were to be memorized and recited back. Those were eventually taken out of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it today. But for the purposes here, Part 1, the doctrine, was the Lectures on Faith. After that, when you got to Part 2, or as you can see here, Part 2, these are the covenants of the church. This is kind of how the church runs. You could maybe even call this like a handbook of instruction for the church back in the day. That is where section 1 sits, is in Part 2. And in that case, it has 8 verses. Modern scriptures, 1981 and beyond at least, have 39 verses. I'm guessing that's just for easier reference. There was also other publications of this, and this is also kind of a cultural shift. In modern times, you kind of have to publish a book, bind it, put it together in order for it to be canonized. Back in the day, publishing it in a periodical was sufficient. So the newspaper at the time, or you could even call it a newsletter if you like, was the Evening and Morning Star. And that was actually published along with what people got in the Book of Commandments when that was first put out. So this section appears in a couple of places, how important that is. So in the Joseph Smith papers, we see it, if you want to read the original handwritings, you'll see it in Revelation Book 1, which is published in Revelations and Translations 1. You can see the Evening and Morning Star from the Revelations and Translations 2, which is all of the published stuff. So it's not handwriting. It's something that was collected into a volume. And then we also get it in the Documents series. So you can get a sense of how it fits chronologically. And so there's a little bit about Section 1, what led to receiving Section 1, some of the circumstances surrounding it, and where you can find it in the Joseph Smith papers. There'll be some links below to discuss those. And if, like I said, if you like, go see them. You can go see what the original handwriting looks like, what the manuscript pages looks like, and what it even looked like in the Evening and Morning Star.